Loss has a way of opening our hearts to the most unexpected companions. When young Duke Edmund lost his father, grief left him searching for something real in a world full of empty courtly gestures. At the village market, he spent his last penny on a scraggly puppy nobody wanted. The court called it foolish. His advisers questioned his judgment, but Edmund saw something in those wild amber eyes that reminded him of his own untested spirit. While nobles expected grand political moves, the young duke chose quiet mornings in the castle gardens, patiently training his unlikely companion. 3 months later, both man and beast had found their true strength. When danger threatened their village, this simple bond would prove more powerful than any royal decree. Could a simple act of compassion from a grieving young leader and his unlikely companion save an entire village from destruction? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Millbrook like a gentle shroud, softening the edges of a village that had weathered countless seasons. Nestled between rolling green hills and ancient oak forests, this quiet settlement had known peace for as long as its eldest residents could remember. The castle stood sentinel on the modest rise at the village's heart, its weathered stone walls telling stories of generations past. Not grand by kingdom standards, but sturdy and honest, much like the people it protected. Duke Edmund Ashworth stood at his study window, watching the village wake below. At 32, he possessed the kind of thoughtful demeanor that came from books rather than battlefields. His dark hair, perpetually tousled from running his fingers through it while reading, caught the early light. The signet ring on his finger, his father's ring, felt heavier each day, a constant reminder of duties he never expected to inherit so soon. 3 months had passed since the fever claimed Duke William, leaving Edmund to navigate the treacherous waters of nobility without a compass. The court expected decisiveness, political acumen, and strategic marriages. What they received was a scholarly young man who preferred the company of ancient texts to ambitious nobles, who found more wisdom in village conversations than in diplomatic maneuvering. "Your Grace," came a voice from behind him. Edmund turned to find Master Aldrich, his chief adviser, standing in the doorway with the perpetual expression of someone who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. A man of 60-odd years, Aldrich had served Edmund's father faithfully for decades, and his loyalty was beyond question. His patience, however, had been wearing thin lately. "The morning reports, Master Aldrich?" Edmund asked, settling behind the massive oak desk that still felt foreign to him. The leather-bound training journal lay open beside official correspondence, its pages filled with his careful observations about canine behavior and leadership principles, an odd combination that would have amused his father. "Several matters require your attention," Aldrich began, his tone carefully neutral. "Lord Pemberton requests an audience regarding the northern trade routes. Lady Catherine has sent another invitation for dinner, which we both know is her mother's continued attempt to arrange a suitable marriage. And there's the matter of your recent acquisition." Edmund's jaw tightened slightly. "You mean my dog?" "The creature you purchased at the market, yes." Aldrich's disapproval was carefully veiled, but unmistakable. "Your Grace, the court is concerned about your priorities. A duke should focus on affairs of state, not training wild animals." Through the window, Edmund could see the dog in question. The animal was no longer the terrified, snarling creature he'd found cowering in a wooden crate at the village market. 3 months of patient work had revealed something remarkable beneath that matted coat and fearful disposition. The dog, Edmund had named him Shadow for the way he seemed to appear and disappear at will, possessed an intelligence that bordered on uncanny. Perhaps the court would benefit from understanding that leadership isn't always about grand gestures, Edmund replied, his voice carrying a hint of steel his father would have recognized. "Sometimes it's about seeing potential where others see only problems." The memory of that market day remained vivid in Edmund's mind. He'd gone there not as a duke, but as a grieving son, seeking some connection to the common life his father had always valued. The old merchant's weathered hands had trembled as he tried to control the snarling puppy, his voice heavy with resignation as he'd explained that no one wanted such a wild creature. "Just a penny, your grace," he'd said, recognizing Edmund despite his common clothes. "I can't afford to feed him much longer." That single copper coin had purchased more than a dog. It had bought Edmund his first real lesson in leadership. While his advisors saw foolishness, Edmund had recognized something of himself in those desperate amber eyes. Both of them thrust into roles they hadn't chosen, both trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to break them. "Master Aldrich," Edmund said, closing the training journal with deliberate care, "my father once told me that the measure of a leader isn't found in how he handles the easy decisions, but in how he responds to the unexpected. Perhaps this village needs a duke who understands that strength comes in many forms." Aldrich's expression softened slightly, the stern advisor giving way momentarily to the man who had genuinely cared for Edmund since childhood. "Your father was a remarkable man, your grace, but he also understood the importance of political alliances. The kingdom grows more unstable each day. We need friends, not pets." Before Edmund could respond, a commotion arose from the courtyard below. Through the window, they could see Shadow moving with purpose toward the main gate, his posture alert in a way that had become familiar to Edmund over these past months. The dog's instincts had proven remarkably reliable. He seemed to sense visitors long before the guards spotted them on the road. "Visitors approaching," Edmund observed, noting how Shadow's behavior had shifted from casual alertness to focused attention. "He always knows before we do." A young guard burst into the study without proper ceremony, his face flushed from running. "Your grace, riders approaching from the east. 3 men, traveling hard by the look of their horses." Edmund rose, instinctively reaching for the window to observe the approaching party. The riders were indeed pushing their mounts, suggesting urgency rather than casual travel. Shadow had positioned himself strategically near the gate, not aggressively, but with the kind of protective stance that had emerged during their training sessions. "Thank you, Thomas," Edmund said to the guard. "Have Captain Morris meet them at the gate with appropriate courtesy, but remain alert." As the guard departed, Aldrich moved closer to the window. "Your grace, these could be the first of many such visits. Word has spread about your unconventional approach to leadership. Some see opportunity in a young, untested duke." The truth in those words settled heavily in the room. Edmund knew that his scholarly reputation had preceded his ascension to the dukedom. There were those who viewed him as weak, others who saw potential for manipulation, and still others who simply questioned whether a man who preferred books to battles could protect their interests. Below in the courtyard, Shadow had shifted again, his attention now focused entirely on the approaching riders. The dog's behavior had become something of a barometer for Edmund. The animal's instincts seemed finely tuned to threats and opportunities alike. It was as if 3 months of patient training had awakened something in the creature that went beyond typical canine responses. "Master Aldrich," Edmund said, his voice taking on the tone his father had used when making important decisions, "I want you to observe something. Watch how Shadow positions himself, how he reads the situation before we even know what we're facing. That's the kind of instinctual leadership this village needs, not the political maneuvering that destroyed my father's health with worry." The older man followed Edmund's gaze to the courtyard, where the dog waited with remarkable patience and focus. Despite his initial reservations about the animal, Aldrich had begun to notice the creature's unusual behavior patterns. There was an intelligence there that defied explanation, a loyalty that had emerged through Edmund's gentle persistence rather than harsh discipline. "Perhaps," Aldrich said carefully, "there are different kinds of wisdom." Edmund smiled, the first genuine smile Aldrich had seen from him in weeks. "Now you're beginning to understand. The village needs a leader who can read situations, who builds trust through patience rather than fear. and who understands that sometimes the most unlikely alliances prove the strongest. The sound of horses' hooves on cobblestones grew louder as the riders entered the courtyard. Edmund watched as Captain Morris approached them, with his hand resting casually on his sword hilt, alert but not aggressive. Shadow remained motionless, but Edmund could see the slight tension in the dog's posture that suggested readiness for whatever might come. "Shall I have them shown to the Great Hall?" Eldrick asked, already moving toward his role as the Duke's representative. "Yes," Edmund replied, but his attention remained focused on the scene below. Something about these riders struck him as significant, though he couldn't yet articulate why. Shadow's behavior reinforced that instinct. The dog's focus hadn't wavered since first detecting their approach. As Aldrich departed to receive their guests, Edmund remained at the window, studying the interaction below. The lead rider was dismounting now, his movement suggesting both urgency and respect. Whatever brought these men to Millbrook, it would likely test Edmund's still-developing leadership skills. He thought of his father, of the countless times Duke William had stood at this same window, making decisions that affected the lives of everyone in the village below. The signet ring seemed to grow warmer against his finger, and Edmund found himself drawing strength from that connection to the past, while facing whatever challenge the future might bring. Shadow looked up toward the study window then, as if sensing Edmund's attention. For a moment, man and dog shared a look of understanding that transcended words, two unlikely companions preparing to face whatever came next. Together, the three riders brought news that would shatter the peaceful morning like a stone through glass. Edmund received them in the great hall, its ancient tapestries and worn wooden floors bearing witness to generations of difficult conversations. The lead messenger, a weathered man named Marcus, whose travel-stained clothes spoke of hard riding, delivered his report with the efficiency of someone accustomed to bearing unwelcome tidings. "Your Grace," Marcus began, his voice carrying the weight of serious concern, "I bring word from the villages to our north and east. Strange happenings, Your Grace. Livestock disappearing without trace, travelers reporting being followed by unseen watchers, and fear growing in communities that have known peace for decades." Edmund felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle more heavily on his shoulders. Behind him, Shadow had entered the hall and taken his customary position near the hearth, but the dog's behavior was markedly different. Where usually he would settle into a comfortable rest, Shadow remained standing, his amber eyes fixed on the messenger with an intensity that had become Edmund's signal for serious attention. "What manner of disappearances?" Edmund asked, gesturing for the men to be seated while servants brought refreshment. "Wild animals. Bandits." The second rider, younger than Marcus but with the same hard-traveled appearance, spoke up. "That's just it, Your Grace. No signs of struggle, no tracks leading away, no evidence of predation. The animals simply vanish. 3 sheep from Northbrook last week, a prize bull from Eastmere 2 days past. The villagers are beginning to talk of dark magic." Edmund's scholarly mind immediately recoiled from supernatural explanations, but his growing leadership instincts warned against dismissing the villagers' fears too quickly. Fear, regardless of its foundation in fact, could destabilize an entire region if left unaddressed. "And the watchers you mentioned." He pressed, noting how Shadow's ears had perked up at certain words in the conversation. Marcus nodded grimly. "Merchants and travelers report the feeling of being observed, particularly at dusk and dawn. Some claim to have seen figures moving parallel to the roads, keeping pace but never approaching directly. No threats, no contact, but the feeling of being studied." Master Aldrich, who had been listening from the side of the hall, stepped forward with an expression that Edmund had learned to recognize as deeply troubled. "Your Grace, there's something else you should know. This morning, before these gentlemen arrived, I received correspondence from the royal court." Edmund's stomach tightened. Communications from the royal court invariably brought complications that a newly ascended duke was ill-equipped to handle. "What nature of correspondence?" "A suggestion, Your Grace. The Crown believes it would be advantageous for you to consider marriage to Lady Rosalind of Westmarch. The union would strengthen the kingdom's northern defenses and provide you with experienced counsel in matters of statecraft. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Edmund understood the political logic. His scholarly reputation and late succession had marked him as potentially vulnerable, and the royal court sought to shore up what they perceived as a weak position. But the timing, coinciding with reports of regional instability, he felt deliberate in a way that made his instincts prickle with warning. "I see," Edmund said carefully, his gaze moving between the messengers and his advisor. "And I suppose this suggestion came with a timeline for consideration." Eldric's uncomfortable expression provided the answer before his words did. "The royal court hopes for a response within the fortnight. Your Grace, Lady Rosalind is expected to arrive for a formal introduction." Edmund rose from his chair, needing movement to process the convergence of pressures suddenly bearing down on his still uncertain leadership. As he paced, Shadow moved with him, maintaining a protective distance that had become second nature to both man and dog during their morning training sessions. "Master Aldrich," Edmund said, his voice taking on a tone that surprised even him with its authority, "please arrange for these gentlemen to be given proper hospitality and rest. They've ridden hard to bring us important news, and we're grateful for their service." As the messengers were escorted out, Edmund remained in the great hall with only Aldrich and Shadow for company. The silence stretched between them until finally the older advisor spoke. "Your Grace, I understand this feels overwhelming, but perhaps the Crown's suggestion has merit. Lady Rosalind is known for her intelligence and political acumen. She could provide guidance during these uncertain times." Edmund stopped his pacing and looked directly at his advisor. "Master Aldrich, in 3 months of working with Shadow here, I've learned something important about leadership. Trust cannot be commanded or arranged for political convenience. It must be earned through consistent action and genuine understanding." Shadow, as if responding to his name, moved closer to Edmund's side. The dog's presence had become a source of stability for the young Duke, a reminder that strength could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. "The disappearances concern me more than royal marriage arrangements," Edmund continued. "If there are indeed threats to our neighboring villages, then Millbrook may be next. That requires immediate attention." Aldrich nodded slowly, his expression shifting from concern about political matters to recognition of more immediate dangers. "What would you have us do, Your Grace?" Before Edmund could respond, a commotion arose from the courtyard outside. Through the tall windows of the great hall, they could see guards gathering around someone who had apparently just arrived. Shadow's behavior changed instantly. His relaxed posture became alert, his attention focused on the disturbance with an intensity that made Edmund's pulse quicken. Another messenger? Eldrick wondered. But Edmund was already moving toward the window. The scene outside was different from the morning's arrival. This was a single rider, his horse lathered with sweat and foam, suggesting desperate flight rather than purposeful travel. The rider himself appeared to be barely maintaining his seat, slumping forward as guards moved to assist him. "Fetch Captain Morris," Edmund ordered, already heading for the door. "And have someone tend to that horse immediately." They reached the courtyard as the guards were helping the rider dismount. The man was young, perhaps 20, with the build of a farmer rather than a professional messenger. His clothes were torn and dirty, his face marked with scratches that suggested travel through dense brush or brambles. Most telling of all were his eyes, wide with the kind of fear that comes from witnessing something beyond ordinary understanding. "Your Grace," the young man gasped, recognizing Edmund despite his obvious distress. "I bring word from Riverside Village. They're gone, Your Grace. All of them." The courtyard fell silent, except for the sound of the exhausted horse's labored breathing. Edmund felt Shadow press against his leg, the dog's warmth a steadying presence as he processed what he'd just heard. "Explain yourself," Edmund said gently but firmly. "What do you mean, gone?" The young man, Edmund now recognized him as Thomas, the blacksmith's apprentice from Riverside, struggled to find words for what he'd witnessed. "I was out checking the far pastures, Your Grace, like I do every morning. When I returned to the village, empty. Every house, every shop, the church. No signs of struggle, no blood, no bodies. Just empty. Captain Morris had arrived and was listening with the professional attention of a career soldier. But even his experienced demeanor showed cracks of concern at this report. "How many people?" Edmund asked. "Near 40 souls, Your Grace. Families I've known my whole life. Children I played with as a boy. All vanished as if they never existed." Edmund looked down at Shadow, who had moved to sit directly in front of him, amber eyes fixed on his face with an expression that seemed almost human in its intelligence. The dog's message was clear. This was no ordinary threat, and it demanded an extraordinary response. "Thomas," Edmund said, his voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone present, including himself, "you'll stay here tonight as our guest. Captain Morris, I want patrols doubled and scouts sent to verify this report. Master Aldrich, send word to the neighboring villages to increase their watchfulness." As orders were acknowledged and people began to move with purpose, Edmund remained in the courtyard with Shadow beside him. The peaceful morning had transformed into something far more complex and dangerous than anything his studies had prepared him for. The signet ring on his finger caught the afternoon light, reminding him of his father's words about the unexpected challenges that define a leader's true character. Whatever was happening in the region, whatever forces were moving against the peaceful villages of their domain, Edmund knew that his response would determine not just his own fate, but the survival of everyone who looked to him for protection. Shadow's low growl, almost inaudible but unmistakably threatening, suggested that the young Duke's first real test as a leader was about to begin. The village bell hadn't rung for anything more urgent than Sunday services in over a decade. But as dawn broke the day after Thomas's harrowing report, its bronze voice called across Millbrook with a tone that made every resident stop their morning tasks and listen. Edmund had made the decision during a sleepless night. If mysterious threats were emerging from shadows, then the village needed to stand united in the light. By the time the sun cleared the eastern hills, the town square was filled with faces that Edmund had seen countless times, but was only now beginning to truly know. There was Margaret the baker, Flower still dusting her apron from the morning's work. Willem the blacksmith stood beside his teenage son, both bearing the solid build and steady demeanor of men who shaped iron with their hands. Old Henrik, the village storyteller whose weathered face held decades of accumulated wisdom, leaned heavily on his walking stick, but stood with the dignity of someone who had witnessed history unfold. Shadow moved through the crowd with a purposeful calm that drew Edmund's attention. The dog's behavior had shifted since yesterday's revelations. No longer the playful companion of their training sessions, but something more focused and protective. When children reached out to pet him, Shadow allowed their touch, but never took his attention fully away from the surrounding area, as if constantly scanning for threats that humans might miss. "Friends and neighbors," Edmund began, his voice carrying across the square with a confidence that surprised him. "You've heard disturbing news from our surrounding villages. Rather than let fear and uncertainty grow in darkness, I've chosen to share what we know and discuss how we might best protect our community." A murmur ran through the crowd, not of fear, but of appreciation for being treated as capable adults rather than subjects to be protected from difficult truths. Edmund saw nods of approval, particularly from the older residents who remembered his father's similar approach to village challenges. Willem raised his heavy hand. "Your Grace," Thomas spoke of entire villages vanishing without trace. How does something like that happen without anyone hearing about it until after? It was exactly the kind of practical question Edmund had been hoping for, not panic-driven speculation about dark magic, but thoughtful inquiry into the mechanics of the mystery they faced. An excellent question, Willem. Captain Morris has sent scouts to verify Thomas's report and gather more information about the pattern of these disappearances. What we know suggests careful planning rather than random attacks. Someone or something is studying our region with great care before acting. Henrik stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of age and experience. "Your Grace, in my years I've heard stories from the old times. Sometimes threats that seem magical have quite earthly explanations. Raiders who strike at dawn, slavers who know how to move captives without leaving tracks, even plague that can empty a settlement in days." The old man's words had a calming effect on the crowd. By offering rational explanations for seemingly supernatural events, Henrik was helping to channel their concerns into productive thinking rather than paralyzing fear. "Henrik speaks wisdom," Edmund acknowledged. "We're dealing with human intelligence and planning, not supernatural forces. That means we can understand it, anticipate it, and defend against it." As if to emphasize Edmund's point, Shadow moved to sit directly beside the young Duke. His presence a quiet demonstration of loyalty earned through patient effort, rather than demanded through authority. The symbolism wasn't lost on the assembled villagers. Their Duke had taken something wild and untrusting and transformed it into a loyal companion through consistent care and attention. Margaret spoke up from the crowd. "Your Grace, what would you have us do? We're bakers and farmers, not soldiers." Edmund looked out over the faces before him, honest, hard-working people who had trusted him with their safety despite his youth and inexperience. The weight of that responsibility was daunting, but Shadow's steady presence beside him provided an anchor of confidence. "You're right, Margaret. You're not soldiers, but you are the people who know every path, every hiding place, every unusual sight or sound in this region. You're the ones who notice when something doesn't belong or when patterns change. That knowledge is more valuable than any weapon." He gestured toward the ancient bell that had summoned them. "This bell has called our community together for generations. It will be our signal system. 1 ring for General Assembly, 2 rings for urgent news, 3 rings for immediate danger. Every household should designate someone who can reach the square quickly if the bell sounds." Willem nodded approvingly. "Good thinking, Your Grace. But what about defending ourselves if these threats come to Millbrook?" Before Edmund could answer, a commotion at the edge of the square drew everyone's attention. Captain Morris was approaching with 2 of his scouts, their faces grim with fresh information. Shadow's behavior changed instantly, his relaxed posture shifting to high alert as he focused on the approaching men. "Your Grace," Captain Morris called out, his voice carrying across the crowd. "We have confirmation from Riverside Village. Thomas's report was accurate. 43 people gone without trace." A collective intake of breath swept through the crowd, but Edmund noticed that panic didn't follow. Instead, there was a focusing of attention, a gathering of resolve that spoke well of the village's character. "What did your scouts observe, Captain?" Edmund asked, including the entire crowd in the conversation, rather than treating it as a private military briefing. "No signs of violence?" "Your Grace." Houses left as if the occupants had simply stepped out for a moment. Meals half prepared, doors standing open, livestock wandering loose in the streets. "But here's the peculiar thing." Morris paused, clearly struggling with how to explain what he'd discovered. "Speak freely." "Captain," Edmund encouraged, "there were tracks. Your Grace, not human tracks, but animal tracks. Large dogs, we thought at first, but the pattern was wrong. The spacing was too regular, too purposeful. As if," Morris glanced at Shadow, then back to Edmund, "as if the animals were following specific orders." Edmund felt Shadow's body tense against his leg, the dog's attention now completely focused on Captain Morris. The animal's behavior suggested recognition of something significant in the scout's report, though Edmund couldn't yet interpret what that might mean. "How many animals?" Edmund asked, his scholarly mind immediately focusing on the details that might reveal the larger pattern. "Hard to say for certain, Your Grace, but at least a dozen, possibly twice that number. All moving in formation, all following the same route toward the eastern hills." Henrik stepped forward again, his weathered face thoughtful. "Your Grace, in the old stories there were always tales of beast masters, people who could command animals through training or other means. Never gave them much credence, but perhaps the old storyteller's words sparked a memory in Edmund's mind, something he'd read in his father's private papers about historical accounts of organized animal attacks used as military tactics in ancient warfare. The idea seemed fantastic, but then again, 3 months ago, the idea of training a wild puppy to become a loyal companion had seemed equally unlikely. "Thank you, Captain Morris," Edmund said. "Continue your patrols and send word if you discover anything else unusual." As the captain departed with his scouts, Edmund turned back to the assembled villagers. Their faces showed concern but not despair, exactly the kind of resilient response that gave him confidence in their ability to face whatever challenges lay ahead. "Friends," he said, his voice carrying newfound authority, "we face an unusual threat, but not an insurmountable one. Tonight, I want every family to secure their homes and animals. Tomorrow, we begin organizing watches and defensive measures." Shadow rose from his sitting position and moved through the crowd again, but this time his behavior was different. He seemed to be studying the assembled people, as if memorizing faces and scents. Several villagers noticed his attention and responded with gentle words or cautious pats. And Edmund realized he was witnessing something remarkable. His companion was actively building relationships with the people they both were sworn to protect. As the crowd began to disperse, Willem approached Edmund directly. "Your Grace, my forge could produce weapons if needed. Nothing fancy, but good iron that will hold an edge." "Thank you, Willem. That may indeed prove necessary." Edmund paused, watching Shadow interact with a group of children who had remained behind. "But I suspect we'll need to be more clever than simply armed if we're to solve this mystery." The blacksmith followed Edmund's gaze to the dog, who was now allowing the children to examine his coat while maintaining his watchful awareness of the surrounding area. "And that's quite an animal you've got there, Your Grace. Seems to understand more than most dogs." Edmund smiled, the first genuine expression of pleasure he'd felt since the crisis began. "Indeed he does, Willem. Indeed he does." The wooden token felt smooth between Edmund's fingers as he turned it over repeatedly, a nervous habit that had developed during the long hours of planning that followed the village assembly. The simple carved disc had been given to him by the old merchant who sold him Shadow, a receipt of sorts for the penny transaction that had changed both their lives. Now it served as a reminder of the connection he'd built with the common people of Millbrook. A bond that grew stronger even as external pressures mounted. 3 days had passed since Captain Morris's disturbing report, and each dawn brought new challenges to test Edmund's developing leadership. The morning brought word that Lady Rosalind of Westmarch had begun her journey to Millbrook, accompanied by a retinue appropriate to her station and political importance. Master Aldrich had delivered this news with the carefully neutral expression he wore when discussing matters he knew would complicate Edmund's already difficult situation. "Your Grace," Aldrich said as they stood in Edmund's study, reviewing the morning reports, "Lady Rosalind's advance party should arrive by week's end. The lady herself will follow within days." Edmund looked up from the detailed map he'd been studying, his father's careful annotations marking defensive positions, water sources, and strategic vantage points throughout their domain. The old Duke's foresight was proving invaluable as Edmund planned Millbrook's response to whatever threats were moving through the region. "And I suppose the royal court expects a swift courtship and favorable decision?" Edmund asked, though he already knew the answer. "The Crown's interests would be best served by a prompt alliance, yes." Aldrich paused, studying Edmund's face. "Your Grace, Lady Rosalind is by all accounts an intelligent and capable woman. This arrangement could provide significant advantages during these uncertain times." Shadow, who had been resting beside Edmund's desk, raised his head at the tone of the conversation. The dog's ability to sense tension and respond appropriately had become one of Edmund's most valuable assets in recent days. When village delegations came with concerns, Shadow's calm presence helped ease their worries. When court officials arrived with demands, the dog's protective positioning reinforced Edmund's authority. "Perhaps," Edmund said, returning his attention to the map. "But I've learned something important these past months, Master Aldrich. Trust and loyalty cannot be commanded through political arrangements. They must be earned through consistent action, Before Aldrich could respond, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Thomas, the young man who had escaped Riverside Village's mysterious fate, entered with the tentative manner of someone still adjusting to his role as Edmund's newest source of intelligence about the regional threats. "Your Grace," Thomas said, "you asked me to report anything unusual." "No matter how small." "Indeed I did," Edmund replied, gesturing for Thomas to continue. Over the past 3 days, the young man had proven remarkably observant, his farmer's eye for detail providing insights that formal military scouts might miss. "It's about the animal behavior, Your Grace. Yesterday evening, while I was helping with the watch duties, I noticed something strange. The dogs in the village, all of them, became restless at exactly the same time. Not barking, not aggressive, just alert, like they were listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear." Edmund felt Shadow's body tense slightly beside him. The dog's amber eyes fixed on Thomas with an intensity that suggested recognition of something significant in the young man's report. "How long did this behavior last?" Edmund asked. "Perhaps a quarter hour, Your Grace. Then, as suddenly as it began, every dog in Millbrook relaxed and went back to normal behavior. But here's the strange part. Shadow wasn't affected. He remained calm throughout, as if whatever was influencing the other dogs had no power over him. The information sent a chill through Edmund's scholarly mind as connections began forming between disparate observations. Captain Morris's reports of organized animal tracks, the mysterious disappearances without signs of struggle, and now evidence of some form of influence over domestic animals. The pattern suggested a threat unlike anything in his historical readings. "Thomas," Edmund said carefully, "during your time in Riverside Village, did you ever notice anything unusual about animal behavior? Perhaps dogs acting strangely or wild animals seeming more organized than normal?" The young man considered the question seriously, his face reflecting the kind of deep thought that comes from examining familiar memories in new light. "Now that you mention it, Your Grace, there had been talk lately about the hunting dogs losing their effectiveness. Several of the village hunters complained that their hounds seemed distracted, unreliable. Some even refused to track game they'd normally pursue eagerly." Edmund exchanged a meaningful look with Master Aldrich, who had been following the conversation with growing concern. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to suggest a threat that operated through manipulation and control rather than direct force, which would explain the lack of violent evidence at the disappeared villages. "Thank you, Thomas," Edmund said. "Continue to observe and report anything unusual, no matter how insignificant it might seem." After Thomas departed, the study fell silent, except for the sound of Shadow's steady breathing. The dog had moved closer to Edmund's chair, his presence offering comfort during what was becoming an increasingly complex crisis. "Your Grace," Aldrich said quietly, "if someone or something has the ability to influence animal behavior on this scale, then traditional defensive measures may prove inadequate." Edmund nodded, his fingers once again finding the wooden token from the market transaction. The simple piece of carved wood reminded him of the patience and persistence that had transformed a wild, frightened puppy into the loyal companion now watching over him. Perhaps those same qualities would be needed to protect Millbrook from whatever forces were gathering in the shadows. "Master Aldrich," Edmund said, rising from his chair with newfound determination, "I want you to send word to the surrounding villages that still remain intact. Invite their leaders to a council meeting here in Millbrook. If we're facing a threat that can coordinate animal behavior across wide distances, then we need to coordinate our human response equally well." "An excellent idea. Your Grace, when shall I schedule this gathering?" Edmund looked down at Shadow, who met his gaze with that remarkable intelligence that had first caught his attention in the village market. The dog's steady confidence reminded him that seemingly impossible challenges could be overcome through patient effort and clear thinking. "Within the week," Edmund replied. "Before Lady Rosalind's arrival. I want our defensive plans established before we become distracted by other obligations." The irony wasn't lost on him. While the royal court expected him to focus on marriage negotiations that would theoretically strengthen the kingdom, Edmund was instead building alliances based on mutual necessity and shared danger. The contrast between political marriages arranged for convenience and bonds forged through genuine partnership couldn't have been clearer. As afternoon settled over the castle, Edmund found himself drawn to the gardens where he and Shadow had spent so many morning training sessions. The space had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where the complexities of leadership could be temporarily set aside in favor of the simpler truths found in the relationship between man and dog. Shadow moved ahead of him along the familiar paths, but his behavior was noticeably different from their usual leisurely walks. The dog paused frequently to investigate scents and sounds that hadn't concerned him in previous weeks, his posture suggesting a heightened awareness that made Edmund increasingly grateful for his companion's presence. "What do you sense that I'm missing?" Edmund asked quietly, though he hardly expected an answer. Shadow's response was to move closer to Edmund's side, positioning himself in the protective stance that had become second nature during their months together. The message was clear. Whatever threats were gathering around Millbrook, they wouldn't face them alone. The sound of approaching footsteps drew Edmund's attention to the garden entrance, where Captain Morris appeared with his characteristic efficient stride. The soldier's expression suggested news that wouldn't improve Edmund's already complex day. "Your Grace," Morris said, offering a respectful bow, "I bring word from our extended patrols. 2 more villages have been found empty, Millfield to the north and Oakenheart to the southeast. St. Patna's Riverside. No signs of violence, no bodies, just abandoned." Edmund felt the weight of responsibility settle more heavily on his shoulders. 7 villages now, with nearly 300 people, vanished without explanation. The scope of whatever they faced was becoming clear, and it was far larger than anything a single duke could handle alone. "Captain," Edmund said, his voice steady despite the growing dread, "I want you to pull back our extended patrols to a defensive perimeter around Millbrook. If this threat is moving systematically through the region, we need to prepare for the possibility that we're next." Morris nodded approvingly. "A wise precaution, Your Grace. Should I also send word to the royal court about these developments?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to Edmund's independence. Informing the Crown about the regional crisis would certainly bring military assistance, but it would also bring royal oversight of his decisions and likely interference with his developing plans to protect the village through local alliances rather than external authority. Not yet. "Captain," Edmund decided, "let's see what our village council meeting reveals first. Perhaps this threat can be addressed more effectively through regional cooperation than royal intervention." As Morris departed to implement the new patrol patterns, Edmund remained in the garden with Shadow beside him. The dog's calm presence reminded him that the most important lessons of leadership often came from the simplest sources: patience, consistency, and the willingness to earn trust rather than demand it. The wooden token felt warm in his palm as he turned it over once more, remembering the old merchant's grateful smile when Edmund had paid his penny for the unwanted puppy. That simple transaction had taught him more about the nature of leadership than years of studying political theory. Sometimes the most valuable alliances came from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the greatest strength emerged from what others perceived as weakness. As evening approached and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Edmund knew that the real test of his leadership was just beginning. Lady Rosalind's arrival would bring the weight of royal expectations and political pressure, but the mysterious threat moving through, their region would demand something more fundamental, the kind of courage that came from genuine care for those under his protection. Shadow moved closer to his side as they prepared to return to the castle, and Edmund found himself grateful once again for the companion who had taught him that true loyalty couldn't be commanded, only earned through consistent devotion to those who depended on him. The hidden map lay spread across Edmund's father's private desk, like a revelation. Its carefully drawn lines and notations speaking of decades of careful observation and strategic thinking that had never been shared with the court or recorded in official documents. Edmund had discovered it purely by accident while searching through his father's personal effects for any information that might help defend Millbrook against the growing regional crisis. Duke William's hand had marked every defensible position within a day's ride of the village, noted water sources that could sustain a siege, and identified escape routes through terrain that would challenge even experienced trackers. Most intriguingly, the map showed a network of caves and underground passages that Edmund had never suspected existed, their entrances cleverly concealed within the familiar landscape of his childhood. Your father was a more careful planner than any of us realized, Master Aldrich observed, leaning over Edmund's shoulder to study the detailed annotations. These defensive positions could hold a small army for weeks if properly supplied. Shadow had positioned himself near the study's main entrance, his behavior since dawn suggesting an alertness that put Edmund on edge. The dog's ability to sense approaching developments had become reliable enough that Edmund now treated the animal's moods as an early warning system for significant events. "The question," Edmund said, tracing one of the marked routes with his finger, "is whether my father anticipated this specific kind of threat, or whether he was simply preparing for any eventuality that might endanger the village." Before Aldrich could respond, Shadow's posture shifted from alert to active concern, his ears forward, body tense, attention focused on something beyond the closed study door. Edmund had learned to trust these signals completely, and he moved quickly to the window that overlooked the main courtyard. The scene below explained Shadow's reaction immediately. A messenger had arrived, but this wasn't the usual official courier or village farmer bringing news. This was a woman on a lathered horse, her travel clothing torn and dirty, her face marked with the kind of desperation that came from witnessing something beyond normal comprehension. "Another survivor," Edmund said grimly, already moving toward the door. "Shadow, with me." They reached the courtyard as Captain Morris was helping the woman dismount, her legs barely able to support her weight after what had obviously been a desperate flight. She was perhaps 40 years of age, with the calloused hands and practical bearing of someone accustomed to hard work. Her eyes, however, held the haunted look that Edmund was beginning to recognize in those who had encountered whatever force was moving through their region. "Your Grace," she gasped, recognizing Edmund despite her distressed state. "I am Sarah, wife to the miller of Westbrook Village. I bring terrible news." Edmund felt his stomach tighten. Westbrook lay only half a day's ride to the southwest, closer to Millbrook than any of the other affected communities. If the pattern was moving in their direction, they had even less time than he'd hoped. "Catch your breath first, Sarah," Edmund said gently, gesturing for servants to bring water and a chair. "Then tell us what you've seen." As the woman gathered herself, Shadow moved to sit directly in front of her, his amber eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that seemed to have a calming effect. Edmund had noticed this. Before, his companion seemed to possess an instinctive understanding of human distress and responded with exactly the kind of steady presence that helped people find their courage. "They came in the early morning mist," Sarah began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "Not people, Your Grace. Animals, dozens of them moving like soldiers in formation. Dogs and wolves, but also stranger creatures, bears that should have been hibernating, wild cats that had no business working together." Edmund exchanged a look with Captain Morris, who was listening with the professional attention of someone evaluating a military threat. The pattern of animal coordination was becoming clearer with each report. But it raised questions that challenged everything Edmund had learned about natural behavior. Were there any people directing these animals? Edmund asked. "That's the strangest part, Your Grace. No human masters visible, but the creatures moved with such purpose, such organization, that someone or something had to be controlling them. They surrounded the village before dawn, then called to our own animals." "Called to them how?" Sarah struggled to find words for what she'd witnessed. Not sounds we could hear, Your Grace, but every dog in Westbrook began moving toward the forest as if summoned by invisible voices. Our horses, our livestock, even the cats, all walking calmly toward the tree line as if they belonged with these wild creatures. Edmund felt Shadow press against his leg. The dog's warmth a reassuring presence as the implications of Sarah's story became clear. Whatever force they faced didn't simply attack communities directly. It turned their own animals against them, removing both protection and companionship in a single coordinated action. What happened to the people? Edmund asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. That's when the fear began in earnest, Your Grace. With our animals gone, we felt exposed, vulnerable in ways we'd never experienced. Some families tried to barricade themselves in their homes. Others attempted to flee on foot. But the wild animals had positioned themselves to cut off every escape route. Sarah paused, her hands shaking as she relived the terror of that morning. Shadow moved closer to her chair, offering silent comfort that seemed to help her continue. The last thing I remember clearly was a sound, not quite a howl, not quite a song, that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It made people compliant. They stopped trying to hide or run. They simply walked toward the forest as calmly as the animals had. Edmund's scholarly mind recoiled from the implications, but the evidence was becoming too consistent to dismiss. Some form of influence that worked on both animals and humans, sophisticated enough to coordinate large-scale operations across multiple communities, and powerful enough to overcome natural survival instincts. How did you escape? Captain Morris asked, his soldiers' training focused on practical details that might inform their defensive planning. I was in the mill when it began. Your Grace, the sound of the grinding stones must have masked whatever call was affecting the others. By the time I realized what was happening, most of my neighbors were already walking toward the forest. I managed to reach my horse and flee before whatever controls them could affect me as well. Edmund knelt beside Sarah's chair, his voice gentle but urgent. This is important, Sarah. Did you notice anything about the animals that seemed unaffected? Any that resisted the call like you did? She considered the question carefully, her face reflecting the effort of examining traumatic memories for useful details. Now that you mention it, Your Grace, there was old Rex, the priest's ancient hound. He seemed confused by what was happening, kept looking back and forth between the forest and the village as if he couldn't decide which call to follow. But he was very old, nearly deaf. The information sparked a thought in Edmund's mind, something about the connection between the mysterious influence and the animal's ability to perceive it. Shadow had remained unaffected during the incident Thomas had described, and now Sarah mentioned an elderly, deaf dog showing resistance to whatever force controlled the others. Captain Morris, Edmund said, rising from beside Sarah's chair, I want you to gather every person in Millbrook who works closely with animals. Farmers, hunters, anyone who understands animal behavior. We need to learn everything we can about how this influence operates. As Morris departed to carry out his orders, Edmund remained in the courtyard with Sarah and Shadow. The woman was resting now, the immediate terror fading as she found herself among people who believed her story and were taking action to address the threat. Your Grace, she said quietly. There's one more thing. As I was fleeing, I saw something in the forest. A figure watching from the tree line, too far away to make out clearly, but definitely human. Someone was directing all of this. Edmund felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in his mind. The coordinated animal attacks, the systematic elimination of village after village, the supernatural-seeming influence over both beasts and humans, all of it pointed to a human intelligence sophisticated enough to weaponize the natural world itself. Shadow moved to stand beside Edmund, his presence a reminder that even the most daunting challenges could be overcome through patience, understanding, and the willingness to forge bonds based on trust rather than control. Whatever force threatened Millbrook had turned the natural order into a weapon. But Edmund had learned something equally powerful in his months with his canine companion. True loyalty couldn't be commanded, only earned, As evening approached and the implications of Sarah's report settled over them like gathering storm clouds, Edmund knew that the time for preparation was rapidly running out. Soon they would face whatever had destroyed 7 villages and claimed hundreds of lives. And their only advantages would be the connections they had built and the trust they had earned through consistent care for those under their protection. The letter arrived with the morning light, carried by a rider whose clean clothes and well-rested horse marked him as distinctly different from the desperate refugees who had been reaching Millbrook in recent days. The parchment bore the elegant script of someone educated in courtly correspondence, and as Edmund unfolded it in his study, he found himself reading words that made his heart race in ways that had nothing to do with the regional crisis consuming his attention. "My Lord Edmund," the letter began in a hand that spoke of careful education and natural grace, "I write to you from the road, still 2 days distant from your lands, but already eager for our introduction. The reports I have received of your character give me hope that our meeting will be one of genuine understanding rather than mere political convenience. I confess that I approach this arrangement with both curiosity and trepidation, for I have heard whispers that you are a man who values substance over ceremony, depth over display. If this is true, then perhaps we might find common ground despite the circumstances that bring us together. I remain, with growing anticipation, Lady Eleanor of Willowmere." Edmund read the letter twice, his scholarly mind immediately noting the intelligence and warmth that suffused every carefully chosen word. This wasn't the formal correspondence of a woman resigned to political marriage, but the genuine communication of someone who hoped to find real connection despite arranged circumstances. Master Aldrich, who had been waiting patiently for Edmund's reaction to the morning's correspondence, cleared his throat diplomatically. "Your Grace, I should mention that Lady Eleanor's advance party sent additional information. The lady is not apparently Lady Rosalind of Westmarch." Edmund looked up from the letter, confusion replacing the unexpected pleasure he'd been feeling. "I'm sorry, what?" "It seems there was some confusion in the royal court's communications, Your Grace. Lady Rosalind was originally intended for this alliance, but Lady Eleanor of Willowmere volunteered to take her place. Apparently, she had heard reports of your unconventional approach to leadership and requested the opportunity to meet you herself." The news sent a strange mixture of relief and anticipation through Edmund's chest. Instead of a woman resigned to political duty, he would be meeting someone who had actively chosen to come to Millbrook. Someone whose letter suggested both intelligence and genuine interest in who he was as a person, rather than simply what he represented politically. Shadow, who had been resting near the hearth, raised his head at the change in Edmund's emotional state. The dog's ability to read human moods had become so finely tuned that he often reacted to Edmund's feelings before Edmund himself fully understood them. "There's more, Your Grace," Aldrich continued, though his expression suggested reluctance to add complications to an already complex situation. "Lady Eleanor's advance party also brought word that she travels with an unusually large retinue, including several specialists in animal behavior and what they term natural philosophy. Apparently, she has her own interests in the connection between human leadership and animal loyalty." Edmund felt his pulse quicken for entirely different reasons now. A woman who understood the deeper principles behind his work with Shadow, who saw value in the unconventional bonds he'd been building. This was far more than he had dared hope for in any political arrangement. Before he could fully process the implications, a commotion arose from the courtyard below. Through the study window, Edmund could see Captain Morris approaching with several villagers, their faces bearing the kind of urgent concern that had become all too familiar in recent days. "Trouble?" Aldrich asked, moving to the window beside Edmund. "Always," Edmund replied, but his tone carried less weariness than it might have a week earlier. The prospect of meeting someone who might genuinely understand his approaches to leadership had given him a renewed sense of hope. Even in the face of the mysterious threat surrounding them, they descended to the courtyard where Captain Morris was organizing what appeared to be a heated discussion between several of the village's most experienced animal handlers. Willem the blacksmith was there, along with old Henrik and Margaret the baker, whose cats were legendary for their ability to predict weather and detect strangers from remarkable distances. "Your Grace," Morris said, as Edmund approached, "we've been discussing the information you requested about animal behavior, and we've discovered something significant." Margaret stepped forward, her practical demeanor carrying none of the deference she might have shown in more formal circumstances. "Your Grace, we've been comparing notes about our animals' reactions to recent events, and there's a pattern that troubles us." "What kind of pattern, Margaret?" "The younger animals are more susceptible to whatever influence we're facing," she explained. "My older cats remained calm during the incident Thomas described, but the younger ones were clearly agitated. Willem reports similar behavior from the horses in his care." Willem nodded agreement. "The old mare I've had for 12 years barely reacted, Your Grace, but the 3-year-old gelding was skittish for hours." Edmund felt a chill of recognition as pieces of the puzzle aligned in his mind. Shadow was young, perhaps 2 years old, but had shown complete immunity to the mysterious influence affecting other animals. What made his companion different from the pattern emerging in their observations? "Henrik," Edmund said, turning to the elderly storyteller, "in your experience with the village animals over the years, have you ever heard of anything like this? Animals of different ages responding differently to external influences?" The old man's weathered face reflected deep thought as he considered the question. "There are old tales, Your Grace, of beast masters who could call animals to their service. But the stories always mentioned that the strongest bonds were with creatures raised from birth by the master. Animals with established loyalties were harder to turn." The insight struck Edmund like lightning. Shadow hadn't just been trained by Edmund. The dog had been shaped from his earliest experiences by patient, consistent care that built genuine trust rather than mere obedience. Whatever force was controlling the regional animals relied on something different, something that could overcome natural instincts but struggled against bonds forged through deep personal connection. "Captain Morris," Edmund said, his voice taking on the authority that had been developing throughout the crisis, "I want you to send word to any remaining villages in our area. Tell them to keep their oldest and most bonded animals close, and to be especially wary if their younger livestock begins showing unusual behavior." As Morris departed to carry out the orders, Edmund remained in the courtyard with the assembled villagers and Shadow at his side. The dog's presence had taken on new significance, not just as a companion, but as living proof that the mysterious threat could be resisted through the power of genuine connection. "Margaret," Edmund said, "I want you to work with Henrik and Willem to identify every animal in Millbrook that has strong bonds with specific people. If our theory is correct, those animals may be our best early warning system for whatever's coming." The group began to disperse with new purpose, but Henrik lingered, his expression thoughtful. "Your Grace, there's something else from the old stories that might be relevant. The beast masters in the tales always required some form of focus for their power, a talisman, a special location, something that anchored their ability to control animals across great distances." Edmund felt his hand move unconsciously to the wooden token in his pocket. The simple carved disc that represented his connection to the common people of Millbrook. The idea that their enemy might have a similar focus, some object or location that enabled the supernatural influence over animals, offered the first hint of vulnerability in what had seemed like an unstoppable force. "Thank you, Henrik," Edmund said. "That information may prove more valuable than you realize." As the afternoon settled over the village, Edmund found himself walking the familiar paths of the castle gardens with Shadow beside him. But now their routine training sessions carried new weight. Every moment of connection between man and dog was preparation for a battle that would be won or lost based on the strength of bonds built through patience rather than force. Lady, Eleanor's letter crinkled softly in his pocket as he moved, its promise of understanding and genuine connection, offering hope for the future if they could survive the immediate crisis. The thought that someone might truly appreciate the unconventional approaches he'd been developing gave him strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Shadow moved closer to his side as they walked. The dog's loyalty, a reminder that the most powerful forces in the world weren't always the most obvious. Sometimes true strength came from the quiet bonds built through consistent care, and sometimes the greatest victories were won by those who understood that leadership meant serving those who depended on them rather than demanding their service in return. The discovery happened during what should have been a routine grooming session in the castle gardens, the kind of peaceful morning activity that had become sacred to both Edmund and Shadow over their months together. Edmund was working carefully through a tangle in the dog's fur when his fingers encountered something unexpected, a section of the coat that felt different, smoother, with an underlying hardness that didn't belong. Shadow remained perfectly still as Edmund investigated, his amber eyes watching with the patient trust that had developed between them. As Edmund carefully parted the fur, his breath caught in his throat. Hidden beneath the dog's outer coat, so skillfully concealed that months of daily contact hadn't revealed it, was a collar unlike anything he'd ever seen. The silver was worked with incredible artistry, its surface covered in intricate patterns that spoke of master craftsmanship and royal patronage. But it was the central medallion that made Edmund's hands tremble as he examined it, a coat of arms he recognized from his studies of neighboring kingdoms. The distinctive heraldry of the royal house of Valdris. "Shadow," Edmund whispered, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and growing dread. "What are you?" Master Aldrich's approach through the garden paths came at the worst possible moment, his footsteps alerting Edmund to the need for caution even as his mind reeled from the implications of his discovery. The silver collar was clearly designed to be hidden, suggesting secrets that could have far-reaching political consequences. "Your Grace," Aldrich called out, his tone carrying the urgency that had become commonplace in recent days. "We have visitors approaching. A large party from the east, flying banners I don't recognize." Edmund quickly smoothed Shadow's fur back over the hidden collar, his scholarly mind racing through the implications of what he'd discovered. The kingdom of Valdris lay 3 days' ride to the east, ruled by King Marcus, whose reputation for political cunning was matched only by his legendary devotion to his hunting hounds. If Shadow bore the royal arms of Valdris, then Edmund had unknowingly purchased far more than a homeless puppy for his single penny. "How large a party?" Edmund asked, rising from beside Shadow with as much composure as he could manage. 20 riders, Your Grace, with additional pack animals, moving with purpose but not apparent aggression. They should reach our gates within the hour. Edmund felt the weight of impending crisis settle over him like a physical burden. The timing couldn't have been worse. Lady Eleanor's arrival was expected within days. The mysterious threat that had consumed 7 villages was drawing ever closer to Millbrook. And now representatives from a foreign kingdom were approaching with unknown intentions. "Master Aldrich," Edmund said, his voice carefully controlled despite the turmoil in his mind. "Have Captain Morris prepare a formal reception, but ensure our guards remain alert. Unknown visitors during times like these require careful attention." As Aldrich departed to make arrangements, Edmund remained in the garden with Shadow, studying the dog's face for any sign that the animal understood the significance of what had just been revealed. The intelligent amber eyes that met his gaze held their usual warmth and loyalty, but now Edmund wondered what other secrets lay hidden beneath that familiar exterior. "You're not just any dog, are you?" Edmund said quietly, running his hands through Shadow's fur, with new awareness of the hidden collar beneath. "The question is, are you here by accident or design?" The hour that followed passed with agonizing slowness, as Edmund struggled to maintain his normal routine while his mind wrestled with the implications of his discovery. If Shadow truly belonged to the royal house of Valdris, then the approaching riders were likely searching for their stolen property. The political ramifications of having unknowingly purchased a kidnapped royal animal could destroy any hope of maintaining Millbrook's independence from external interference. Captain Morris's approach across the courtyard signaled the arrival of their visitors. Through the main gates came a procession that spoke of wealth, power, and serious political purpose. The lead rider bore himself with the bearing of nobility, his rich clothing and fine horse marking him as someone accustomed to command. Behind him rode what was clearly a mix of soldiers and what Edmund's educated eye recognized as professional animal handlers, people whose expertise lay in tracking and recovering valuable livestock. "Your Grace," the lead rider called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying across the courtyard with practiced authority. "I am Lord Commander Garrett of Valdris, sent by His Majesty King Marcus on a matter of urgent importance to both our kingdoms." Edmund descended the castle steps with Shadow at his side, the dog's behavior noticeably different from his usual calm alertness. There was a tension in Shadow's posture that suggested recognition, not fear exactly, but wariness that made Edmund's pulse quicken with anxiety. "Lord Commander," Edmund replied, offering the courtesy due to a foreign dignitary while maintaining his own authority, "you're welcome to Millbrook. How may we assist you?" Garrett's eyes immediately fixed on Shadow with an intensity that confirmed Edmund's worst fears. The man's expression shifted from diplomatic politeness to something approaching triumph as he studied the dog standing loyally beside Edmund. "Your Grace," Garrett said, his voice taking on the formal tone of official business, "I bring greetings from King Marcus and a request for the return of stolen property. 3 months ago, a valuable hunting hound was taken from our royal kennels by thieves unknown. Our investigations have led us to believe that this animal may have found its way to your lands." Edmund felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as the carefully built stability of his leadership faced its greatest challenge yet. The simple penny purchase that had brought Shadow into his life was about to become a diplomatic crisis that could threaten everything he'd worked to build in Millbrook. "Stolen property is a serious accusation, Lord Commander," Edmund replied, his voice steady despite the churning anxiety in his chest. "Perhaps you could describe this missing animal so we might determine if we've encountered it." Garrett gestured to one of his companions, a grizzled man whose weathered hands and keen eyes marked him as a master of his craft. "This is Master Houndkeeper Aldwin, who raised the missing animal from birth. He would recognize the creature instantly." Aldwin stepped forward, his attention immediately focusing on Shadow with professional assessment. The dog remained motionless beside Edmund, but there was something in his posture, a subtle shift in weight, a barely perceptible tension that suggested he recognized the approaching man. "That's him," Aldwin said quietly, his voice carrying certainty that cut through Edmund's hopes like a blade. "That's Prince, the finest hound ever bred in the royal kennels. Note the distinctive amber eyes, the particular set of his ears, the pattern of darker fur along his spine." Edmund felt Shadow press closer against his leg, the dog's warmth a reassuring presence, even as the political implications of the situation threatened to overwhelm him. The animal that had become his closest companion, the living symbol of his unconventional approach to leadership, apparently belonged to another kingdom entirely. "Your Grace," Lord Commander Garrett continued, his tone taking on the weight of formal diplomatic protocol, "King Marcus has authorized me to offer generous compensation for the animal's return. We understand that you acquired him innocently and bear no responsibility for the original theft." The courtyard fell silent except for the sound of horses shifting impatiently and the distant calls of village life continuing beyond the castle walls. Edmund found himself facing a choice that would define not just his own future, but the survival of everyone who depended on his protection. "Lord Commander," Edmund said carefully, "this is obviously a matter that requires careful consideration. Would you and your men accept our hospitality while I review the situation?" Garrett nodded with the practiced diplomacy of someone accustomed to delicate negotiations. "Of course, Your Grace." His Majesty expected that proper procedures would need to be followed. As arrangements were made for the visitor's accommodation, Edmund retreated to his study with Shadow beside him. The hidden collar felt like a burning secret beneath the dog's fur. Its silver weight carrying the power to reshape everything Edmund thought he understood about his companion and his own situation. The training journal lay open on his desk, its pages filled with observations about Shadow's remarkable intelligence and loyalty. Now those same qualities took on new significance, not the result of Edmund's patient training, but evidence of royal breeding and professional preparation that predated their relationship entirely. "What am I supposed to do?" Edmund asked quietly, looking down at Shadow's upturned face. The dog's expression held the same warmth and devotion that had sustained Edmund through the difficult months since his father's death. But now that loyalty was complicated by questions of ownership and political obligation that threatened to tear apart the bond they'd built together. Shadow's response was to move closer to Edmund's chair, his presence a reminder that whatever political complications might arise, the connection between them had been forged through genuine care and mutual respect. The hidden collar might mark him as property of another kingdom, but the loyalty he'd freely given belonged to Edmund alone. Outside the study windows, evening was settling over Millbrook, bringing with it the promise of difficult decisions and uncertain outcomes that would test every principle Edmund had learned about leadership, loyalty, and the price of doing what was right. The armor felt foreign against Edmund's shoulders as he stood before the great mirror in his father's chambers. The familiar weight of scholarly robes replaced by steel and leather that spoke of duties he'd never expected to embrace. Duke William's ceremonial armor had been crafted for a larger man, but the castle's armorer had worked through the night to adjust the fit, understanding without being told that this was more than preparation for ceremony. This was a son finally accepting the full burden of his inheritance. Shadow watched from the doorway, his amber eyes reflecting an intelligence that Edmund now understood in an entirely different context. The dog who had been his closest companion for 3 months was actually Prince, a royal hunting hound whose breeding and training represented years of careful work by the finest handlers in the kingdom of Valdris. Yet despite this revelation, Shadow's behavior toward Edmund hadn't changed. The loyalty remained absolute. "The protective instincts unwavering, Your Grace," Master Aldrich said softly from behind him. "Lord Commander Garrett requests an audience before his planned departure. He wishes to finalize arrangements for the transfer." Edmund turned from the mirror, the armor's weight reminding him of the gravity of the decisions ahead. In the hours since Garrett's arrival, the situation had evolved from diplomatic complexity to potential catastrophe. Word had come during the night that the mysterious force threatening the region had finally reached Millbrook's borders. 3 families from the outlying farms had vanished without trace, following the same pattern that had claimed 7 entire villages. "In a moment, Master Aldrich. First I need to understand something." Edmund moved to his desk where the hidden map lay open, his father's careful notations now taking on urgent relevance. "These defensive positions my father marked, they're not just for repelling human attackers, are they?" Aldrich studied the map with the fresh perspective that crisis brings to familiar things. "Your Grace, I believe your father anticipated threats that might come from unconventional directions. Note how many of these positions offer protection from attacks that could come through the forests rather than along established roads." The insight confirmed what Edmund had begun to suspect Duke William had been preparing for exactly the kind of threat they now faced, an enemy that moved through wilderness areas and commanded the natural world as a weapon. The question was whether Edmund could implement his father's defensive plans while simultaneously handling the diplomatic crisis surrounding Shadow's true identity. "Master Aldrich, send word to Captain Morris. I want every defensive position on this map, manned by teams of our most experienced hunters and trackers. If we're facing an enemy that uses animals as weapons, Then we need people who understand animal behavior at every critical point. As Aldrich departed to relay the orders, Edmund knelt beside Shadow, looking into the intelligent eyes that had been his anchor through months of difficult leadership challenges. The dog's breeding and training might belong to another kingdom, but the bond between them had been forged through genuine mutual respect and care. "Whatever happens next," Edmund said quietly, running his hands through the familiar fur, "I want you to know that these months together have taught me everything I needed to know about true leadership. Not the kind that demands loyalty, but the kind that earns it through consistent devotion to those under your protection." Shadow's response was to move closer, pressing his warmth against Edmund's side, in the gesture that had become their private language of comfort and reassurance. Whatever royal breeding the dog might possess, whatever political complications his presence might create, the connection between them transcended ownership and obligation. The sound of approaching footsteps announced Lord Commander Garrett's arrival, his bearing suggesting a man accustomed to getting what he came for. Behind him walked Master Houndkeeper Aldwin, whose weathered face showed the kind of professional satisfaction that comes from successfully completing a long and difficult search. "Your Grace," Garrett began, his tone carrying diplomatic courtesy that barely concealed underlying impatience. "His Majesty King Marcus has been most generous in his offer of compensation for the return of his property. We're prepared to depart as soon as proper arrangements can be completed." Edmund rose from beside Shadow, the armor lending him a presence that he'd never possessed in scholarly robes. The weight of steel on his shoulders reminded him that some decisions required the kind of strength that came from accepting responsibility rather than avoiding it. "Lord Commander," Edmund replied, his voice carrying new authority, "I'm afraid the situation has become more complicated than a simple matter of returning stolen property." Garrett's expression sharpened with the alertness of a professional diplomat, recognizing unexpected resistance. "Your Grace, surely you understand that harboring royal property, however innocently acquired, creates obligations that transcend personal preferences." "Indeed it does," Edmund agreed, moving to stand beside the window that overlooked the courtyard where his people were preparing defensive positions according to his father's carefully planned specifications. "But it also creates questions about how that property came to be available for purchase in the first place." The subtle challenge in Edmund's words sent a visible tension through the Valdris delegation. Master Aldwin stepped forward, his weathered face showing concern that went beyond professional duty. "Your Grace," the Houndkeeper said carefully, "Prince was stolen from our kennels by thieves unknown. We've been searching for months, following every possible lead." Edmund turned to face the delegation directly, Shadow moving to stand beside him in the protective stance that had become second nature during their months together. "And yet, Master Aldwin, this remarkable animal was offered for sale in our village market by a merchant who claimed to have found him abandoned and wild. Either your security is remarkably lax, or there are elements to this situation that haven't been fully disclosed." The silence that followed was broken by the arrival of Captain Morris, whose urgent manner immediately shifted the room's attention from diplomatic negotiations to more pressing concerns. "Your Grace," Morris said, his voice carrying the controlled urgency of a soldier reporting critical intelligence, "our scouts have confirmed movement in the eastern forests. Large groups of animals converging from multiple directions, all heading toward Millbrook. Based on the patterns we've observed, we estimate they'll reach our perimeter by dawn." Edmund felt the convergence of crises reaching its breaking point. The mysterious force that had claimed 7 villages was finally making its move against Millbrook, arriving at precisely the moment when diplomatic complications threatened to divide his attention and resources. "How large a force, Captain?" Edmund asked, his military training finally finding practical application, difficult to estimate precisely. "Your Grace, but our scouts report at least 100 animals of various species, all moving with the coordinated purpose we've come to associate with this threat," Lord Commander Garrett's expression had shifted from diplomatic impatience to genuine concern as the implications became clear. Your Grace, are you suggesting that Millbrook is under attack by animals? I'm stating that fact, Lord Commander. For the past weeks, this region has been systematically attacked by a force that uses coordinated animal behavior as a weapon. 7 villages have been completely emptied of their populations, and now that same threat has reached our borders. The revelation sent a visible shock through the Valdris delegation. Master Aldwin's weathered face showed the kind of recognition that comes from professional experience with animal behavior beyond normal understanding. Your Grace, Aldwin said quietly, in my 40 years of working with hunting hounds, I've encountered stories of beastmasters, individuals who could command animal loyalty through methods that went beyond normal training. I always considered them tales meant to frighten children, but if what you describe is accurate, Edmund nodded grimly, then we're facing an enemy whose capabilities exceed anything in recorded military history. The question now is whether King Marcus would prefer to recover his property intact or to collect the remains after Millbrook falls to this unprecedented threat. The blunt statement of alternatives had exactly the effect Edmund intended. Garrett's diplomatic composure cracked slightly as he processed the implications of returning to his king with news that the missing royal hound had been lost to supernatural enemies while under foreign protection. Your Grace, Garrett said carefully, if Millbrook is indeed under attack, then perhaps King Marcus's interests would be better served by ensuring the survival of all parties involved. Before Edmund could respond, Shadow's behavior changed dramatically. The dog moved to the window, his posture shifting to high alert as he focused on something beyond the glass. His low growl, barely audible but unmistakably threatening, sent a chill through the room. They're testing our defenses, Edmund said, recognizing the signs that had become familiar over the past weeks. Captain Morris, sound the alert. All defensive positions are to be manned immediately. As Morris departed to implement the emergency preparations, Edmund turned back to the Valdris delegation with renewed purpose. Lord Commander, you and your men are welcome to depart if you choose. But if you remain, I would be grateful for any assistance you might provide. Your experience with animal handling could prove invaluable in the coming confrontation. Garrett looked at Master Aldwin, whose professional instincts were clearly engaged by the unprecedented challenge they faced. The old houndkeeper's eyes were fixed on Shadow with new understanding, not just of the animal's royal breeding, but of the remarkable bond that had developed between dog and master during their months together. Your Grace, Aldwin said slowly, Prince was trained as more than a hunting companion. He was bred and prepared to serve as a guardian, capable of recognizing and responding to threats that ordinary dogs might miss. If what approaches Millbrook is truly the kind of supernatural menace you describe, then his presence here might not be coincidence. The word sent a new understanding through Edmund's mind as pieces of a larger puzzle began to align. Shadow's immunity to the mysterious influence affecting other animals, his exceptional intelligence and protective instincts, his uncanny ability to sense approaching threats, all of it suggested preparation for exactly the kind of enemy they now faced. Master Aldwin, Edmund said, his voice taking on the authority of command, I propose a temporary alliance. Help us defend Millbrook against this threat, and afterward we'll address the question of Shadow's, Prince's, ultimate destination. The houndkeeper looked to Lord Commander Garrett, who nodded slowly. Agreed, Your Grace. King Marcus values the recovery of his property, but he values the lives of his subjects more. If we can assist in protecting Millbrook, then we serve both kingdoms' interests. As the Valdris delegation prepared to join Millbrook's defensive preparations, Edmund remained at the window with Shadow beside him. The dog's continued alertness suggested that whatever approached through the forest was drawing closer, bringing with it the greatest test of Edmund's leadership and the strongest challenge to the bond he'd built with his unlikely companion. The armor felt lighter now, no longer a burden, but a tool, for the protection of those who depended on him. Whatever happened in the hours ahead, Edmund knew that he would face it with the lessons learned during months of patient work with the remarkable animal at his side. That true strength came from connections built on trust, and that the greatest victories belonged to those who understood the difference between commanding loyalty and earning it. The ancient oak table that had served as the center of diplomatic negotiations for 3 generations of dukes now became something unprecedented, a war council, where the survival of Millbrook would be decided not through traditional military strategy, but through an understanding of forces that challenged every assumption about the natural world. Edmund stood at the head of the table, his father's armor lending him an authority that felt both foreign and necessary. Around the scarred wooden surface sat an unlikely alliance. Captain Morris with his professional military bearing, Lord Commander Garrett representing the interests of a foreign kingdom, Master Aldwin, whose expertise with animal behavior had suddenly become crucial to their survival, and Master Aldrich, whose decades of administrative experience provided the practical foundation for their desperate planning. Shadow lay beside Edmund's chair, but his behavior was markedly different from the calm companionship of their training sessions. The dog remained in constant high alert, his amber eyes fixed on the eastern windows where the first grey light of dawn was beginning to show through the darkness. Every few minutes, his ears would twitch at sounds beyond human perception, and his low growls provided a continuous reminder that their enemy was drawing closer. "The defensive positions are manned," Captain Morris reported, his voice carrying the controlled tension of a career soldier facing an unprecedented threat. "But, Your Grace, our people are frightened. They understand how to fight human enemies, but this coordinated animal attack, it challenges everything they know about warfare." Edmund nodded, understanding the psychological dimension of their crisis. Fear could paralyze even the bravest defenders when they faced something beyond their experience or training. The key to victory would lie not just in tactical preparation, but in maintaining morale among people asked to fight an enemy that seemed supernatural. "Master Aldwin," Edmund said, turning to the Valdris houndkeeper whose weathered face reflected decades of experience with animal behavior. "In your professional opinion, what are we likely to face when this attack begins?" The old man considered the question with the gravity it deserved, his eyes moving between Shadow and the eastern windows, as if reading signs invisible to others. "Your Grace, if the reports from surviving witnesses are accurate, we're dealing with coordinated animal behavior on a scale that exceeds natural possibility. Someone or something is directing this assault with intelligence and purpose that goes far beyond instinctual pack hunting." Lord Commander Garrett leaned forward, his diplomatic training giving way to military pragmatism. "Master Aldwin, in your years of service to King Marcus, have you encountered anything that might explain this level of animal coordination?" "There have been rumors, Lord Commander. Stories from the borderlands of individuals who claimed unusual abilities with animal training. Most dismissed as folklore, but now—" Aldwin gestured toward Shadow, whose continued alertness suggested recognition of approaching familiar forces. "Prince here demonstrates capabilities that go beyond normal canine intelligence. It's possible that whoever bred and trained him understood principles of animal behavior that we've only glimpsed." Edmund felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place as he studied Shadow's behavior. The dog's immunity to whatever influence controlled other animals, his exceptional protective instincts, his uncanny ability to sense approaching threats, all of it suggested preparation for exactly this kind of confrontation. "Master Aldwin," Edmund said carefully, "when Prince was stolen from your kennels, was there any indication of who might have been responsible? Anyone with the knowledge and capability to recognize his special training?" The houndkeeper's expression grew troubled as he considered the implications of the question. "Your Grace, there was one individual who had access to the royal kennels during Prince's training period. A woman named Moira, who claimed to be a natural philosopher studying animal behavior. She spent weeks observing our training methods, asking detailed questions about breeding and conditioning techniques. Captain Morris straightened in his chair, his military instincts recognizing the significance of this information. A spy gathering intelligence about royal animal training methods? Possibly more than that, Captain, Aldwin replied grimly. Moira demonstrated unusual rapport with animals during her time at court. Some of the handlers whispered that she could communicate with creatures in ways that seemed unnatural. Edmund rose from his chair, moving to the eastern window, where the growing light revealed the edge of the forest that bordered Millbrook's lands. Shadow immediately followed, positioning himself beside Edmund with the protective stance that had become second nature during their months together. A woman with supernatural abilities over animals steals a specially trained royal hound, only to have that hound end up in a village market where a grieving duke purchases him for a penny, Edmund said, working through the implications aloud. Either we're dealing with an extraordinary series of coincidences, or Prince's presence here is part of a larger plan. Master Aldrich, who had been listening with growing concern, spoke for the first time since the council began. Your Grace, if this woman Moira has been systematically attacking villages throughout the region, then her arrival at Millbrook was always inevitable. The question is whether Prince's presence here helps or hinders our chances of survival. Before anyone could answer, Shadow's behavior changed dramatically. The dog moved to stand directly in front of the eastern window, his body rigid with attention as he focused on something beyond the glass. His low growl deepened to a sound that raised the hair on everyone's neck, not the warning of ordinary danger, but recognition of an approaching enemy. They're coming, Edmund said, understanding Shadow's message with the clarity that had developed between them over months of shared experience. Captain Morris, signal all defensive positions. The attack is beginning. As Morris moved to implement the alert, Lord Commander Garrett rose from the table with the decisive motion of a career officer accepting unavoidable combat. Your Grace, my men and I pledge our assistance in defending Millbrook. Whatever political complications this creates can be addressed after we survive the next few hours. Master Aldwin remained seated, his attention fixed on Shadow with professional fascination. Your Grace, Prince is reacting to something specific, not just general danger, but recognition of a familiar threat. I believe he knows who's commanding this assault. Edmund looked down at his companion, seeing in those intelligent amber eyes not just loyalty and courage, but knowledge that could prove crucial to their survival. Shadow had been bred and trained for purposes beyond ordinary companionship, prepared for confrontations that challenged the natural order itself. Then we face this together, Edmund said, his hand resting on Shadow's head, in the gesture that had sealed their bond during that first training session months ago. Or whatever brought you to me, whatever forces shaped you for this moment, we'll meet them as we've faced every challenge, united by trust rather than divided by fear. Through the eastern windows, the first signs of movement were becoming visible in the forest. Shadows that moved with too much coordination to be natural, shapes that suggested animals working in formations that defied every instinct of territorial behavior. The attack on Millbrook was about to begin, and with it the ultimate test of everything Edmund had learned about leadership, loyalty, and the power of bonds forged through genuine care rather than demanded through authority. The parchment that would transform the crisis from military confrontation to diplomatic resolution lay unfurled across the oak table like a bridge between kingdoms, its carefully crafted words offering hope where moments before there had been only the prospect of supernatural warfare. Edmund's hand trembled slightly as he set down the quill, the ink still wet on the Treaty of Two Kingdoms that represented not just an end to immediate hostilities, but a new understanding between realms that had viewed each other with suspicion for generations. The woman who called herself Moira stood at the far end of the great hall, her appearance both commanding and surprisingly ordinary for someone whose abilities had terrorized an entire region. She was perhaps 50 years of age, with the weathered hands of someone accustomed to outdoor work and eyes that held depths of knowledge about the natural world that challenged conventional understanding. Most remarkably, she was surrounded by animals that obeyed her with perfect coordination, wolves that should have been mortal enemies of the domestic dogs beside them, bears that sat with the patience of trained hunting hounds, wildcats that watched the proceedings with intelligent attention. "Your Grace," Moira said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command, but also the weariness of someone who had carried a heavy burden for too long. "I admit that your solution exceeds my expectations. When I began this campaign, I anticipated resistance through force, not negotiation through wisdom." Edmund remained standing beside the table, Shadow at his side, in the protective position that had become second nature during their months together. The dog's behavior toward Moira was complex, recognition without fear, alertness without aggression, as if acknowledging a former trainer while maintaining loyalty to his current companion. "Moira," Edmund replied, using her name with the respect due to someone whose power was undeniable, even if her methods were questionable. "Your abilities are remarkable, but your approach was flawed. Terrorizing innocent villages to prove a point about animal welfare serves neither justice nor the creatures you claim to protect." Lord Commander Garrett stood to Edmund's right, his diplomatic training helping him navigate negotiations unlike any in recorded history. The presence of a foreign delegate at these proceedings added weight to whatever agreement they reached, establishing precedent for how such supernatural threats might be addressed through international cooperation rather than individual kingdom responses. "The treaty you propose," Garrett said, addressing both Edmund and Moira, establishes protections for animal welfare that go beyond anything currently recognized in regional law. King Marcus will need to review these provisions carefully. Master Aldwin moved closer to the proceedings, his professional interest in animal behavior clearly engaged by the unprecedented gathering around them. The creatures under Moira's command represented species that should never coexist peacefully. Yet they maintained perfect discipline while remaining relaxed enough to suggest genuine contentment rather than magical coercion. "Moira," Aldwin said, his voice carrying the respect of one expert acknowledging another, "your methods with these animals suggest understanding that goes far beyond conventional training. How do you maintain such coordination without apparent force or fear?" The woman's expression softened slightly at the professional recognition, the first crack in her stern demeanor since entering the hall. "Master Aldwin, true animal loyalty cannot be commanded through fear or magic, only earned through patient understanding of each creature's individual nature. What you see here represents years of building relationships based on mutual respect and benefit." Edmund felt a flash of recognition at her words. They echoed almost exactly the principles he'd discovered during his months of training with Shadow. The idea that someone with supernatural abilities over animals would emphasize the same patient, respectful approach that had guided his own work suggested deeper connections between conventional wisdom and extraordinary capability. "Then we share common ground," Edmund said, moving slightly forward to demonstrate his willingness to bridge the gap between negotiation and understanding. "Shadow here taught me that genuine loyalty emerges from consistency and care, not from demands or threats." Shadow's response to his name was to move closer to Edmund's side, but significantly. The dog also turned his attention toward Moira with what appeared to be recognition and even a form of greeting. The interaction suggested a complex history between them, not the relationship of property and owner, but something more nuanced and respectful. "Prince," Moira said softly, using Shadow's original name with obvious affection, "I see that your time here has been well spent. You found exactly the kind of partner I hoped you would." The words sent a shock of understanding through Edmund's mind as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Shadow's arrival in the village market hadn't been accident or coincidence. It had been orchestrated by someone who understood that the young Duke needed exactly the kind of companionship that the specially trained royal hound could provide. "You arranged for him to be sold to me," Edmund said, the realization carrying both gratitude and concern about the implications of such manipulation. "I arranged for him to be available to someone who would treat him with the respect and patience he deserved," Moira corrected gently. "The choice to purchase him, to invest time in training and bonding, to see potential where others saw only problems, those decisions were entirely your own." Master Aldrich stepped forward, his administrative mind focused on the practical implications of what was being discussed. "Your Grace, if I understand correctly, this entire crisis has been orchestrated as some form of test or evaluation." "Not orchestrated, Master Aldrich," Moira replied, her tone taking on the weight of someone explaining complex motivations. "The threats to the villages were real, the disappearances genuine, but they were also meant to reveal character, to determine whether the leaders of this region possessed the wisdom and courage necessary to protect their people from supernatural threats." Captain Morris, who had been listening with growing concern, spoke up with military directness. "You emptied 7 villages and terrorized hundreds of people to test our Duke's leadership abilities. I relocated 7 villages whose leaders proved inadequate to protect them from forces beyond normal understanding," Moira corrected firmly. "Every person taken is alive and well in sanctuary locations where they're learning to coexist with the natural world in ways their former communities never taught them. But Edmund here," she gestured toward the young Duke with obvious approval, "demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership that can bridge the gap between human civilization and natural harmony." Edmund felt the weight of responsibility and recognition settling on his shoulders like his father's armor, heavy but appropriate to the role he was finally ready to accept. The treaty on the table represented more than an end to immediate crisis. It was the foundation for a new kind of leadership that acknowledged forces beyond conventional political understanding. "The treaty stands as written," Edmund declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to make such decisions. "Millbrook will serve as a sanctuary for those who seek to understand the balance between human needs and natural harmony. King Marcus's interests are protected through formal alliance, and the people of our region gain security through understanding rather than fear." Shadow moved to stand directly beside the treaty table, his presence a living symbol of the bonds that could be forged between different worlds when built on genuine respect and mutual benefit. The intelligent amber eyes that met Edmund's gaze held not just loyalty, but recognition that they had both found their true purpose in the service of something larger than themselves. The chronicle lay open on the old storyteller's desk, its fresh pages waiting to capture the extraordinary tale that Henrik had been commissioned to record for future generations. The morning light streaming through his cottage window illuminated words that would become legend, the story of how a grieving young duke and a penny purchase had transformed not just one village, but the understanding of leadership throughout the known kingdoms. "The Chronicle of the Penny Duke," Henrik murmured, testing the title that had suggested itself as he began documenting the events that had changed Millbrook forever. A fitting name for a most unfitting story. 6 months had passed since the Treaty of Two Kingdoms had established Millbrook as a center for the kind of enlightened leadership that bridged human civilization and natural harmony. The village that had once seemed destined for obscurity now hosted delegations from across the region, all seeking to understand how Duke Edmund had transformed potential catastrophe into unprecedented cooperation. Edmund himself could be seen through Henrik's window, walking the familiar paths of the castle gardens with Shadow beside him. The dog remained his constant companion, but their relationship had evolved from the desperate bond of mutual need into something more profound, a partnership that demonstrated daily the principles of leadership that had saved their community and established their reputation. The changes in Edmund were visible to anyone who had known him, during the dark months following his father's death. The scholarly hesitation had been replaced by confident authority, but it was authority earned through service rather than inherited through title. The people of Millbrook no longer saw him as the uncertain young man thrust into leadership by tragedy, but as someone who had proven himself through the ultimate test of caring more for their welfare than for his own comfort. Lady Eleanor of Willowmere had arrived the week after the crisis resolved, but instead of the political arrangement originally envisioned by the royal court, she had discovered something far more valuable, a man whose approach to leadership aligned perfectly with her own beliefs about the responsibility that came with noble birth. Their courtship had developed naturally, built on genuine respect and shared values rather than diplomatic necessity. "Your Grace," came a voice from Henrik's doorway, and the old storyteller looked up to see Thomas approaching with the comfortable familiarity of someone whose role had evolved from refugee to trusted advisor. The young man who had escaped Riverside Village's mysterious fate had become Edmund's most valuable liaison with the relocated communities, helping to facilitate the integration that had transformed potential tragedy into opportunity. "Thomas," Edmund called from the garden path, his voice carrying the warmth that had replaced the formal distance of early leadership. "Any word from the eastern settlements?" "All thriving, Your Grace. Moira's methods of teaching sustainable cooperation with wildlife have exceeded everyone's expectations. The relocated villagers report that their new communities are more prosperous and secure than their original homes ever were." Edmund nodded with satisfaction, though Henrik noticed that Shadow's attention had shifted to something beyond their immediate conversation. The dog's remarkable instincts remained as sharp as ever, but now they served a community at peace rather than one under threat. The success of Millbrook's transformation had attracted attention from kingdoms throughout the region. Young nobles arrived regularly to study Edmund's methods, hoping to replicate in their own domains the kind of leadership that earned loyalty through service rather than demanding it through authority. The lessons learned during 3 months of patient training with an unwanted puppy had become principles that were reshaping how an entire generation thought about power and responsibility. Master Aldrich approached along the garden path, his bearing showing the contentment of someone whose administrative skills were finally being applied to building prosperity rather than managing crisis. In his hands, he carried correspondence from the royal court, no longer urgent demands or political pressures, but respectful communications between allies who had found common ground through shared challenges. "Your Grace," Aldrich said, offering the sealed documents. "King Marcus sends his quarterly report on the regional cooperation initiatives. The animal welfare protections established by our treaty have been adopted by 6 additional kingdoms, and requests for similar agreements continue to arrive weekly." Edmund accepted the correspondence with the easy confidence of someone who had grown comfortable with his expanding influence. The frightened young man who had purchased a puppy for a penny had become a leader whose innovative approaches were being studied and replicated across the known world. Shadow moved closer to Edmund's side as they prepared to return to the castle, but the dog's attention remained partially focused on the forest paths where Moira's relocated communities continued to thrive under her guidance. The relationship between the mysterious woman and the Duke had evolved into respectful collaboration, her supernatural abilities complementing his human wisdom to create something greater than either could achieve alone. As evening approached and the familiar routines of village life settled over Millbrook, Henrik returned to his chronicle with renewed purpose. The story he was recording transcended the simple tale of a duke and his dog. It was documentation of how genuine care and patient understanding could transform even the most daunting challenges into opportunities for growth and connection. The wooden token from that long-ago market transaction sat on Henrik's desk beside the chronicle, its smooth surface worn by countless handling during the months when it had served as Edmund's reminder of his connection to common people. Now it represented something even more significant, proof that the most profound changes often began with the smallest gestures of compassion. Shadow's contented sigh from the garden path drifted through Henrik's open window, a sound that captured perfectly the peace that had settled over Millbrook. The dog, who had been unwanted, unloved, and discarded, had found not just a home, but a purpose that had transformed an entire community. His loyalty, earned through patience and consistency, had become the foundation for a new understanding of what it meant to lead with wisdom rather than rule through fear. As Henrik dipped his quill to continue writing, he reflected on the lesson that would outlast all the political treaties and administrative reforms, that true strength came not from commanding others, but from the courage to remain faithful to those who depended on you, no matter what challenges arose. It was a lesson written in the bond between a man and his dog, but its implications reached far beyond any single relationship to touch every aspect of how communities could thrive when guided by leaders who understood that their greatest power lay in their willingness to serve.